Hello, and welcome back to the Raisina Fireside Chats. And we're here now with Alexander Gabuev, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we're very happy to have him with us. Alexander, thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you.
And you're an expert, in particular, on the relationship between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China.
That's what they say.
And the title of this session that we've given is Pax Sinica, under the assumption that we are entering a world in which countries' relationships with China become more and more important. And I think a lot of people at this point in time would be very interested to ask, what are the long-term drivers of what appears to be an increasing closeness between Moscow and Beijing?
There is a narrative that Sino-Russian cooperation and closer alignment that's so visible in the past 10 to 7 years is a byproduct of Western dual containment policy, that the United States is pushing against Chinese assertiveness and at the same time against Russia, and that's what's driving Moscow and Beijing closer. And otherwise, without the U.S., it's very shallow, empty partnership. There is no there, and it's a marriage of convenience. Well, as many of us know, marriages of convenience can be much more durable than passionate romance. And I think that there are very clear foundations for this partnership, even without the U.S. in the picture. Two countries share a very long continental border that used to be source of tension during the Sino-Soviet split and source of big military challenges and expenditures. It was both risky and very costly. So in the 80s, when the pragmatic leaderships came to power in both capitals, Moscow and Beijing, they decided to settle the territorial issues and turn this into a border of peace and cooperation in order to focus on other priorities. Russia is obsessed with the US and NATO. China is obsessed with South China Sea, Taiwan, Senkakus, and of course, its border with India. So this border needs to maintain its peace, and that's why this is one of the foundational pillars. The second pillar is the economic complementarity. Russia has abundance of natural resources, needs capital and technology. China is exactly the opposite. It's a match made in heaven, and for historic reason, Russia has utilized its very similar economic structure with Europe, but not with China. Now it's time to diversify, and for China, it's also good to tap into alternative sources of raw material. Third pillar, which is also very important, is the similarities of domestic political regimes. Russia preaches to be sovereign democracy. China is a socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics, but neither is a democracy by definition of the US or India or Japan. So this authoritarian nature makes them sit on so many issues of global governance, like sovereignty on the internet, in the same boat. And since two are UNP5 countries, that drives them closer together. And then on top of that, of course, comes the US. What's characteristic of this relationship is the growing asymmetry. So Russia is a weaker party that's not growing fast enough, where China is a rising giant. And that disparity was increasingly visible, where Russia became an increasingly needier partner. That, to me, this trend has been massively accelerated with Russia's invasion in Ukraine.
Which brings me very nicely, thank you, to my next question, which is, how has this relationship changed with the invasion of Ukraine? As you say, it appears that, to us on the outside, it appears that it may have created an increased dependence on Beijing for Moscow. It also has, to our eyes, maybe inaccurately, created the impression that the Russian military is not quite the formidable force that all of us thought it was. How has this changed the political relationship between the countries, and in your opinion, maybe the long-term trajectory of the Sino-Russian relationship?
I think that given the fundamental drivers we talked about, relationship with Russia is still too important for Beijing to throw under the bus. That's why Russia will be kept as China's partner and in China's orbit. At the same time, China is very pragmatic. It understands that its dependency on the US and Europe in terms of market access, access to technology and capital is still very important. So China has developed a policy that resembles China's approach to Russia after Crimea annexation. It has set of talking points that China supports peace, it supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, it doesn't recognize Crimea as part of Russia or Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, and at the same time it criticizes unilateral sanctions, which are bad for the health of the global economy, and it criticizes the push of the US to expand its military alliances. Depends on who's in front of the Chinese officials, they cherry pick from these talking points. So if you are Jake Sullivan, I push on peace, respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, no recognition of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. If you are Nikolai Patrushev, Putin's Security Council chief, I go like, yes, it's because of the US pushing with our military alliances and we don't support the sanctions. So the more the West is trying to push China on, like, you stop sitting on this great Chinese fence, like, get on one side, like, people are butchered in Bucha, it's terrible. They say, yes, peace, support for territorial integrity of Ukraine. And then on sanctions, China does everything what's allowed by sanctions, and as long as Europe continues to buy oil and gas from Russia, China also has legitimate right to do so, just as India. And at the same time, Chinese companies have historic tendency to engage in over-compliance because the sanctions are being piled up. The ugliest pictures of this war have happened, but many more, unfortunately, are in front of us because that's going to be a protracted conflict with no diplomatic solution in sight. Sanctions are being piled up. Chinese companies are very reluctant to go in because they don't know what's legit and what's not legit. And Russia's economy is in free fall. So Chinese leverage talking to the Russians about potential deal is growing week by week. So at some point, major hostilities will stop, sanctions will all be applied, and then Russian economy will find its bottom. And that's the time where China will step in and seek what kind of deals it will pursue, definitely on Chinese terms and very beneficial to China.
Alexander, when, a lot of us who grew up in India grew up with old Soviet books, including books of Russian history. And many of the books that were written about Russian history for kids that we had access to, translated into English by Progress and Raduga publishers, they began with Peter the Great. And the story was that before Peter the Great came along as Tsar, this is a country like any other. But Peter the Great took strong decisions. He was a strong man, tall, could, beat the blacksmith's hammer, hold the blacksmith's hammer himself, etc. And he decided, after touring Europe, that we are a European country. We will get a European capital. We will get a European port. We will be a European country. Today, many of us look at Russia and say, maybe Russian identity is no longer European. Maybe now Russia thinks of itself as a Eurasian or maybe a nation country. Does the border of Europe now stop at the Polish-Russian border?
I would say at Ukraine-Russian border, because there is a very strong push to integrate Ukraine in whatever form
Ruski Mir.
It survives the conflict into Europe. And there is a very strong moral and institutional push to anchor Ukraine in the transatlantic community. We'll see whether that comes along with the EU invitation or NATO invitation. I'm still doubtful, but definitely there is a lot of support. I would doubt that Russia had ever had a fully European identity because the Pacific part to the east of Ural Mountains is still important, and that's what makes Russia not just the biggest country in Europe, but the biggest country in the world, and really player on multiple global chessboards. I think that unfortunately Russia is being deplatformed by Europe, but Russia itself is also canceling its links to Europe. Like, my employer has been chased out of Russia along with German political foundation that had funded many projects in Russia. Many Western companies are going out. And then McDonald's, I remember that when McDonald's opened in Moscow in 1990, that was the symbol of Soviet integration to global economy and then Russia's integration to global economy. Now McDonald's is gone from Russia, as are many other companies. So Russia is not a Eurasian power, but a power that's occupying a huge chunk of Eurasian landmass, but increasingly inward-looking, trying to seek linkages to other players, including China and India, but its ability to do so on its terms is also limited because the potential to develop sophisticated industry, be part of the global economy, global supply chain is limited by sanctions. And then the ability of other parties to reach out. So, for example, India is interested in purchasing sophisticated weapons from Russia. How long will Russia have the ability to produce sophisticated weapons, particularly next generation, where it's so dependent on foreign chips and American technology? Big question mark for everybody. So relevance of Russia beyond having nukes, having still pretty potent or at least big conventional military that you can throw on a problem without counting the soldiers is there, and there is abundance of raw materials. But beyond that, 10, 15 years down the road, the role of Russia as a really global player is unfortunately very questionable. It's not that Russia will disappear and become irrelevant, but think about kind of giant Iran. Iran is still a big power with some regional reach, and it can create a lot of troubles. But whether that's the power that Russia wanted to be, hardly, but that's unfortunately the very likely trajectory, and I really want to be wrong on this.
I think a lot of us remember the pictures of McDonald's opening in Red Square and the people queuing up, and it is extraordinary, I think, to imagine that barely 3 decades later, that has been reversed. And I wanted to sort of end this conversation. You mentioned that Carnegie, that you work for, is no longer in Moscow. It was the first think tank, global think tank to open in Moscow, and it is now
on the same square that McDonald's was. And I used to live across the street up until recently with my nice balcony facing McDonald's.
Well, so tell me, you are no longer employed in Moscow yourself. Many people are also in your position. And here at the Raisina Dialogue, I have overheard people from Armenia. We had many Armenian guests from Istanbul, from Serbia, from Belgrade, saying that our Russian friends have come. They're sitting in our cafes, working on their MacBooks, finding jobs in the globalized economy. Is there a community now of people, of Russians, patriotic Russians, who do not necessarily see themselves as being able to work in Russia anymore, partly for political reasons, partly for economic reasons, because the pipes have been cut off? And what is the impact on Russia to have these two streams of identity? One group inside that is just hearing what the government may want to tell them, and one group outside that is maybe creating a different image of what Russia is.
I was one of the guys with a laptop both in Istanbul and Belgrade recently, because I describe myself as a kind of traveler in residence without any particular residence for now. But I think that first, it's unfair to portray all the Russians that remain inside Russia as regime supporters and blindly believing what the propaganda tells them.
That's very important to hear, because we see the videos of them forming Zeds, and we wonder, is this universal?
It's very hard to figure out the actual rate of support and knowledge, because the remaining independent media, like Echo Moskvy, the backbone of liberal journalism in radio, has gone silent, taken off air. Like Novaya Gazeta, with the Nobel laureate Dmitry Muratov, and my mother is a proud theater critic, and Novaya Gazeta is also stopped publishing. A lot of existing publications like Kommersant and other are very careful in how they write about events. So unfortunately, the picture in Russia is getting grim. But people download VPN, and it's a very telling chart that before the war, the most downloaded apps were Instagram and Facebook, and now it's mostly VPN, because people want to have access to information. So defamation of Russian forces has been criminalized. It's very hard to figure out what the extent of people who don't support it, but believe me, there are very many people who understand that this is a tragedy for Russia and tragedy for Ukraine, where Russia bears moral responsibility and other responsibilities. So not everybody supports that.
That's very good to hear. And I'm going to close with one last question, which is that at what point do you think, I mean, these unilateral and very tough sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, at what point do you think, if at all, people in positions of power in the economy and political side of Russia are going to say, this may not be worth it, there are ways in which we need an off-ramp?
These are not the people who matter. Who matters is Vladimir Putin and people around him, big guys with big guns, mostly from counterintelligence background. They are not affected by sanctions. They're going to die in Fortress Russia with their offspring. And unfortunately, the smart people who are running the economy for them, the governor of the central bank, are doing really good job under impossible conditions.
She's done a terrific job.
So the transition from a prosperous global Russia under some limited sanctions to a giant Iran will not be smooth, but it will not pose any challenge of bottom-up pressure to the regime or cracks in the elite. This regime, unfortunately, is very durable, so whether the people who stay outside of Russia will return one day, which I very much hope, because they are patriots of Russia and they want to contribute to the Russia that's really part of the global community, being outside of Russia, which is the good choice for now. We don't know whether that will happen.
Thanks so much, Alexander, and that's been a very eye-opening discussion for many of us. And thank you for coming for the Raisina Dialogue, and we hope to see you again.
Great to be at this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you.